Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So it's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to my former PhD examiner, David Parkin. David, when and where were you born?
I was born in Watford, north of London, in 1940.
1940. And anthropologists are interested in kinship and sometimes go back over at least to their grandparents' generations. Did you know anything about your grandparents?
Grandparents I did know something about, yeah.
Yeah.
And one member of my family did try and trace back one side, on my mother's side. There's some interesting results.
So what were your grandparents like?
What were my
grandparents like?
Grandparents like? Yes, well, on my father's side, my paternal grandfather was actually a Freemason, but kept all that secret, so none of us really knew what it was about. My grandmother was his wife, very loving and caring. And on the other side, my grandfather, that's my mother's father, was in fact had an interesting life. He once went to Los Angeles with Charlie Chaplin, and the family knew Charlie Chaplin quite well. He was in a circus, this was a very long time ago. He used to box kangaroos. That was my maternal grandfather.
Good training for an anthropologist.
Tough man. And my grandmother was interesting. She married up initially, and then was widowed, and then married my grandfather. So,
what were their occupations apart from circus?
Well, he became a carpenter. Yes, he was quite good at carpentry. And the paternal grandfather, he was a tea buyer, used to buy tea and travel around. He worked for Brook Bonds.
So they were both in England?
They were both in England, yes. Yes, they had no, apart from this trip to Los Angeles with the circus, neither. And of course, both of them fought in the First World War. My paternal grandfather was wounded at the Battle of the Somme, but only marginally. In fact, it probably was a blessing as it got him out of it. And my maternal grandfather fought in Greece, Thessalonica, I think it was.
So we're moving down to your parental generation. What were the characters and occupations of your parents?
Parents. Well, my father worked as a company secretary for various companies after serving in the Second World War, with some distinction, I think. And my mother, basically a housewife, looked after the family in the days when women did this sort of thing.
What were they like as people?
My parents were extremely tolerant, fair, liberal, not to the point of negligence, but they let me do what I wanted to do, I've often thought about this and looked back with gratitude that I was allowed to do what I wanted to do. And they never pushed me, actually. My paternal grandfather pushed me a little bit, but not my parents, and I think it helped actually find what I wanted to do.
What did you want to do at the early age?
At the earliest age, that's a good question. I think probably acting.
Really?
Yes.
When you were a child?
Yes, very early on. Probably seeing Hollywood movies or something as well. As a child, it was always a very special treat, I think. In those days, a long time ago, to see a movie. There weren't too many of them around. And so I became interested in acting. And primary school did act a little. Of course, at secondary school it stopped. But I think it found its way through when I gave lectures. Lecture in anthropology.
Useful art for a lecturer. Were there any other hobbies when you were very small, or any memories of your first sort of 6 or 7 years before you went to your preparatory school?
6, 7 years, not really, no. I mean, a fairly bland life, I think. Trying.
Living
sports.
whereabouts?
Living in Watford.
Watford.
Which I did until quite late, in fact. I became interested in sport. It was absolutely hopeless at primary school. I took an interest and vainly tried to play cricket and football. It's always rejected. And it wasn't until I was in secondary school that the bits and pieces of the body came together miraculously so that I could be sufficiently coordinated to play these games.
So where was your first school that you remember?
Well, it was first primary school was a local primary school, and I stayed at that until I went to grammar school in Watford, and I stayed at that school until university.
Were there any teachers at your first school that you recall with horror or pleasure?
There were a couple, yeah. There was one called Tommy Tucker, who was very kindly disposed and seemed to think that I was bright enough to be worth encouraging. You must remember these were, well, the notional class size was 48, but sometimes it had to be doubled up to 96.
Good heavens.
Because there weren't enough teachers. This is after all from 1945 onwards. And a couple of us managed to get to grammar school out of that 96 cohort for 1 year. Only two of us. And this one teacher was very encouraging. And there was another teacher who was also quite encouraging.
What subject did Tommy Tucker?
Well, primary school was
must have
basically 3 hours. I mean, these are, very down-at-heel local schools which were struggling in the aftermath of the Second World War. But dedicated teachers. Many of them were not fully trained. So there was such a dearth, as you know, of teachers in Britain at that time that people returning from the army were, provided they got shown some skills in some department, other than pulling triggers, were drafted in.
And then you went on to Watford Grammar School.
And I went on to Watford Grammar School,
Well, was that a good school?
It was a brilliant school, absolutely wonderful. I mean, it's, the grammar schools are often, I suppose in a way, quite rightly regarded as elitist. It was part of that that brought about their downfall, but they were a fantastic opportunity for people like me. And it was a great school, and the schoolmasters, as they were called, were dedicated. And I suppose it had the trappings of an independent school. They wore gowns. Might have been an independent school, I know, before it was turned into grammar school. And they all had degrees from university, and wore waterboards on special occasions. And we played good sports, I mean, with very competitive schools within the kind of North London, Hertfordshire area. It was a great school.
Did you play against Welwyn Garden City? Was that somewhere?
Yes, Welwyn was one of them. Haberdashers' Asks. I think it was Bushy Grammar, Berkhamsted. What was the Freemasons?
St Albans?
Yes, I think we did play St Albans.
Because
yes.
of course
yes,
Jack Goody and Colin Renfrew both went, I think, to St Albans Grammar School.
Yes, we did play them. Yes.
A bit earlier.
Yes.
And what subjects were beginning to attract your interest by then?
Well, that's a good question. There was always a tension, I suppose, between science and languages, and unfortunately those days you couldn't do a bit of both. You had to choose either languages or what I suppose we'd call humanities now, or science subjects, or with maths. So I suppose it was more or less decided for me that I would do languages, and so I did, as well as English, of course.
Were you good at languages?
Yeah, I was good. Yeah, French, German, and some Spanish.
And you've always been interested in linguistics.
Sorry?
You've always been interested.
Yes, I've always been interested in language use and in linguistics. Yes, from a very early age. And just enjoyed language learning.
Did your parents take you abroad at that time, or?
No, they didn't. No, but my father had, because he'd been in the Second World War, he quite extraordinarily had managed to learn French and German without any school, not much of a school background in those languages, but he had actually, while serving in the armed forces, and I think that was an influence to hear him speaking French, and even a little bit of German. You know, that parental template, if parents can do it, then you should be able to do it.
And were there any particular teachers then who you remember, either by name?
Yes, well, I suppose the grammar school, the most notable would be the headmaster, a chap called Harry Ray, who was an extraordinary man. He was in fact a French resistance fighter and was honoured for this, but never spoke about it and very much kept very much to himself. But it was common knowledge that he'd served in the resistance. And he came to the school as I did. As I started, he started. Extraordinary man, inspiring, quite unusual educational methods. He then went on to become Professor of Education at York University in this country after I'd left. And he was particularly. There was another teacher, a chap called Taffy Hughes, as he was called then, obviously from Wales, another incredible man, who was the one actually who directed me into the subject I took at university.
What was his subject?
His subject, he was economics and economic history. But he was very perceptive, and he looked at all the boys in the sixth form. And it was an all-boys school, I should have mentioned that, I suppose, and seemed to be able to match them to their likely future successes, the sorts of subjects they should be taking at university, rather than what they were doing. And in my case, for instance, I had thought that I would continue in the modern languages stream and do German and Russian at university. But he said I shouldn't. I should, by all means, keep the languages up, but do something else. And it was this man, Taffy Hughes, and indeed the headmaster, Harry Ray, both of them, drew to my attention the School of Oriental African Studies, which was just opening up to undergraduates at that time. This was, when I went to SOAS, it was 1959. I think they'd had one or maybe two intakes of undergraduates, so they'd only really just started. And they had various degrees and off. One of them was an African Studies degree, as it was called, which combined anthropology, which was taught at the LSE, with Bantu languages or any kind of African group of languages. In my case, it was Swahili with kind of Bantu linguistics. And they showed me this brochure, which I thought was fantastic, very exotic. And of course, like any boy of that age, you're yearning to get out and about and travel the world. And this seemed to be a route. That indeed it proved to be.
Just to finish off on school, were there other things? You mentioned sport.
Yes.
You began to become reasonable.
As I say, the bits and pieces of the body miraculously came together, and I became quite coordinated and played cricket. And I played first for the Colts, and then the second 11, and then the first 11. And it became a passion. I mean, I think it's almost a passion now, actually.
Is it?
I never lose a moment in trying to follow up on scores. Cricket. Rugby, I could only survive as a scrum half in the early years when the size differentials were not too great. By the time it got to the sixth form, I was obviously so small in relation to the other boys that I was a bit of a bad bet. So I gave up rugby, or it gave me up. And so I ran and did athletics instead. But cricket was really the mainstay of the sporting.
What about acting? Did you continue with that?
No, I didn't. No, curiously. No, I think that's possibly because there wasn't any provision for it in secondary school. There was quite a macho element in the school. It was a good school, but there was a certain macho element. I think that acting in those days would have been seen as something we do extramurally and not within the school.
What about music?
Music, I learned the clarinet and played in the orchestra. And kept that up for a while. And eventually, like many of these things, I eventually gave it up.
Has music continued to mean much to you?
Yes.
And what sort of music do you like?
Well, I suppose if I say all forms of classical music, that sounds a bit bland. I suppose 18th century music in particular.
Mozart, Handel,
Yes,
Bach.
Yes. But I'm interested in most forms of classical music.
And other sort of jazz, pop music.
And jazz, yes. I've got quite a collection of jazz discs. And
Do you work to music, or can you not work with music on?
yes, I can only work to music, but not to music and words. So opera's out when I work, but anything else is in.
And you've done quite a lot of work on religion later in your life. Were your parents, did they have any religious affiliation? Or?
Well, my mother was Catholic, of partially Irish background, and she remained a Catholic all her life. She didn't go every Sunday or anything, but it was obviously always a relevant feature of her life. My father wasn't especially a believer or active, but he was Protestant background. His father, my paternal grandfather, was religious, and certainly my paternal grandmother was. So I was from a mixed religious background, Protestant and Catholic. And I suppose my mother in particular encouraged me at least to think religiously. But as I said earlier, she wasn't, neither my parents were in any sense punitive if I didn't do what they told me to do. So she took a fairly relaxed attitude. But I did go to church until I was about 15, I think it was.
Were you confirmed or?
Yes, I was confirmed. I sang in a choir.
And then did you just drift away, or did you have some anti-reaction to it?
At the age of 15, I realised that I couldn't accept these beliefs. So there's a fairly radical break.
And how would you characterise your subsequent religious beliefs up till now?
I suppose I'm a rational humanist or something like that, if that's a bit of a cop-out. It's, I find myself quite annoyed, I suppose, by dedicated religious affiliation. But it gives a lot of comfort to some people, so I must be tolerant.
Do you ever feel, sometimes I feel it's strange that some of the great anthropologists should be Catholics, like Evans Pritchard and so on, your predecessor in Oxford, because they could both see the universal and yet they could stick with their particular version so confidently. Does that strike you as odd, or?
Yes, it has struck me. Yes, yes, indeed, yes. I mean, I do find it difficult, really, for people to subscribe to organised religion when they are also anthropologists. I can understand, I suppose, a belief in some kind of transcendental force, which of course you can then ascribe to physics or some branch of modern science. You don't have to anthropomorphise it. But I do find it difficult that people like Evans Pritchard and Pocock,
Mary Douglas,
and the Nienhards,
Victor Turner
did apparently believe in what the Catholic Church ordained. If it is the case that they really did believe that, or whether there are other factors at work. And I've never really been able to understand what the rationale is.
They sometimes argue that it's their very Catholicism and feeling for religion and having felt it inside them that makes them and Jewish anthropologists particularly good in discerning how religion works. Do you think there's anything in that argument?
Yes, I can understand that. Yes, I think it's very tempting as well. I mean, there is a sense in which the aesthetics and the non-rational converge. And sometimes the only way in which you can reconcile yourself to that sphere of inexplicable occurrences is by appeal to some higher force. But on the whole, I've resisted this, preferring to see it as something we don't yet know about. So in that sense, I suppose you could say I'm agnostic rather than atheist.
Yes, that's what I was probing towards, So let's go to SOAS. What was SOAS like in 1959? Who was there?
SOAS was an extraordinary place, I have to say. And the very first day, in fact, even the interview when I first went there, it was April before the October or whenever, I was just captivated by the place. All these people from different backgrounds and different continents of the world.
It was in Connaught Square then, was it? Or?
It was, well, it is, the main building was where it is now, but the anthropology department was in 27 Woburn Square.
Yes, which is where I knew it. Yes.
Which is where you knew it. But the people who were there, well, as I said earlier, language, like African languages were taught at SOAS at that time, and anthropology was taught at the LSE for the most part. Nevertheless, the Department of Anthropology at SOAS did have anthropologists. It had Christoph von Führer-Handorf, of course, Adrian Mayer, Michael Mendelssohn, and I think by then F.G. Bailey. But as undergraduates, for reasons I've never entirely understood, we were taught at the LSE for the first couple of years. It was really only in the third year that I was taught regularly by one of the SOAS anthropology teachers. In fact, it used to be said, I think at the time, that the anthropologists at SOAS had a rather good time of it, because they had virtually no students, so it was said, whereas the LSE had lots. And of course, subsequently, there was a decision that SOAS should teach its own students, and MSc should teach its own students. But I was lucky in the sense in which I had the privilege of having lectures and some seminars at the hands of people like Maurice Friedman, Raymond Firth, Isaac Shapiro, Burton Benedict, Lucy Mayer, and that was fantastic. There was Firth and Friedman in particular were great lecturers, and one or two seminars, Friedman and Firth, I recall, and also as Darrell Ford was at UCL, and though I didn't have really formal teaching at UCL, there were one or two lectures I could go to. But then in the third year at SOAS, I came under the wing of F.G. Bailey, Freddie Bailey. And he was certainly a very formative influence. I've often felt that I've never been able to thank him enough for that, but maybe the time will come. He taught me to write English for a start.
Seems late in your career to learn that minor skill, but...
Well, you see, before then, and no doubt since, it was long, endless sentences without paragraphs. But he taught me the virtues of short sentences. No, but more seriously, he had extraordinary clarity. And at the time he'd just written, I think it was called Casting the Economic Frontier, which was a Marxist analysis of caste mobility in Orissa, in India. And not only was it clearly written, such that I could understand it, it seemed to me to be an entry into, if you like, a form of Marxism which was you could actually study as an anthropologist. It was not terribly theoretical, and yet clearly was an instance of the economic shaping, or if you like, determining the socio-cultural, indeed the political. So that was an eye-opener, and subsequently he was a very good teacher. I didn't get to know Adrian Mayer curiously until afterwards, until I became a lecturer. Nor indeed even Christoph. Both of them later, of course, were very important.
Bailey later wrote quite a lot of pretty almost cynical but certainly deep analyses of academic and other politics. And
That's right.
So someone who doesn't know him might think he was a rather cynical and suspicious sort of character.
Yes.
But was he like that?
In those days, I think it was more like a clinical attitude. He had this capacity to analyse a situation very quickly and get to the raw bones of a situation, or indeed of a person. He could size them up in no time at all, at least so it seems, to myself and my fellow students. It's true that later on, yes, he developed this, what you might call Machiavellian approach to society and produced all these books, but this largely came after I knew him. So I knew him in the days when he was still interested in, should we say, more larger social issues.
It's sometimes said that in the Oriental and African term described of SOAS, that the Oriental tended to predominate, certainly in the anthropology department, and Africa was rather secondary to that. Was that the case when you were there?
Yes, definitely, yes. Yes, well, Africa in the early days was only represented actually by someone called George Huntingford, who was a former Kenya settler, and I'm afraid had the attitudes that went with many, not all, such settlers. But he did have an extraordinary knowledge of the material culture of some of the so-called Paranilans, or Nilohammers as they used to be called, Kipsigis in particular. And that's what he used to teach. He used to teach material culture in Eastern Africa. He did actually have a great scholarly knowledge, and I know that John Middleton admired his scholarship a great deal. So it was a bit of a paradox. He was a man who would not be your best friend because of his, should we say, his racial views, but who was nevertheless a scholar to be admired. So he was the only Africanist, but that was later remedied, though after I'd ceased being a student, by the arrival of Philip Gulliver, who obviously had a big influence whilst he was there.
So we've moved to a quieter spot, David, just to tell the audience what we're doing. The people you've mentioned, I mean, coming back to this point about Oriental and African, I mean, Christoph was India, Adrian was India, and Thailand. Freddie Bailey was India. So within the department, it was mainly Oriental.
That's right. As indeed Zayas had a very strong, Zayas as a whole had a very strong Indian orientation.
Yep. Just on the LSE side, you mentioned Morris and Friedman and Raymond Firth as good lecturers. Was there anyone in the LSE at that time who particularly you got to know or influenced you theoretically?
Theoretically, not theoretically, no. No, that's an interesting question, actually. I mean, I suppose the lectures were very much aimed at explaining a trend in anthropology and then criticising it. But it tended to be fitted to the syllabus. Maybe some people would disapprove of that. I remember a current colleague of mine used to refer to such lectures as spoon feeding. But they were more than that, actually. They did engage the student. After all, we were undergraduates and we wanted to be given some guidance. And so Friedman in particular was an extraordinary exponent of kinship. In fact, little aside to mention that he used to give his lectures on kinship at 10 o'clock, Wednesdays I think it was. We would troop along, packed house. And then he decided to have a series of lectures next term called Advanced Kinship, but at 9 o'clock. Now, even in the London of those days, it was still difficult to get in from quite a way out, as most people were lodging a distance from the college. But again, it was a packed house. He was such an inspiring lecturer, and as I say, there was no evident theoretical orientation. I don't think one would associate that with Maurice Friedman particularly, but he was a tremendous scholar, had read and researched his sources and was able to present them in a way that was challenging and made us want to run off and read what he'd been talking about. So I think that probably was what one would expect at that level. Possibly F.G. Bailey later influenced me theoretically. But the theoretical influences really, I think, came from reading, and in fact it was really the interest in complex society, which sounds very old hat now, but 1950s, early 60s, there was still, I suppose, a lot of concern about how much we should be studying rural societies and how much we should be looking at polyethnic, complex urban situations. And I tended to plump for the latter, which is what I eventually did for my doctoral study. I actually studied a town. There were already, of course, there was the so-called Rose Livington School, Manchester Rose Livington School, where some very fine studies and monographs have been published. And so I followed that route. People like Earl Epstein and Clyde Mitchell and Max Gluckman, of course. So if there was a theoretical influence, it really came via studies of complex societies. And I suppose of all those Manchester Rose Livington people, mainly Gluckman. So yes, this influence came from outside London, really, in the form of the Manchester Rose Livington School. And I've often referred to that school in my own writings, at least the earlier stuff.
Did you know Gluckman at all?
Yes, I got to know him, yes, quite late in the day.
What was he like?
Extraordinary man, as everyone will have told you already. I met him first properly. I think I'd met him briefly, but met him first actually in Zambia. It was a conference in the early about 1971 or 2 or something of that kind, and I'd been invited to this conference. And he was there, and he decided we should take a trip to Barotseland, which was fantastic, you can imagine. So we travelled. It was a little difficult because it was the time of Smith's declaration of UDI for what was then Southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. And so matters were a little tense. We were, after all, European. We were treated okay, but there were some 1 or 2, tense incidents, even in Zambia, and certainly on the border with Zimbabwe. There were. But he was a very outspoken, forthright person and had very pronounced views, and I could see why he was such a dominant figure at Manchester, and part of me wishes that I'd spent some time under him, but not all that
much time. I think perhaps it was the best of both worlds to have him at a distance. But I did admire him theoretically. No one ever refers to him now, of course. But I maintain to this day that his famous article on the Zulu social situation in Zululand, written and published in 1940, believe it or not, is still one of the best, if you like, works on methodology that I know in anthropology as a starting point for analysing a situation. You take a situation, a crisis situation, and from that crisis situation, principles and affiliations reveal themselves. And so I've always used it myself, and I've always got my students to use it. It never fails.
It led into the famous social drama approaches.
Right, exactly. Yes, Victor Turner and others. I mean, so I do think that we owe Gluckman a great deal. Sometimes I'm a little disappointed that very few people speak of him, or even have heard of him in many cases, because his work is not taught. And I suppose that may be because much of his influence was through personal advice. It is in his writings, but perhaps you have to dig it out rather more.
Were you doing, I mean, you are now living away from the outskirts of London, Watford, and now in central London, presumably, or were you commuting from home? Or
when I was in London, yes, that's right. I used to, when I was at SOAS, what level, a student level or?
A student level, yes.
Yes. Oh no, I lived in London as a student.
And were you doing other things? Were you playing jazz or?
Yes.
Having a social time?
Yeah. It was, well, I played the clarinet, as I mentioned before, and we used to have traditional jazz bands. Pretty awful.
So, at the end of your undergraduate course, you had decided you really liked anthropology, presumably?
Yes, I wanted to continue.
And how did you continue?
Well, in a sense, I was lucky because having done this effective double honours degree in Swahili Bantu linguistics on the one hand and anthropology on the other, I was equipped for not only for the anthropology but also to take an interest in language shift and to use the language. In fact, because there were quite a large number of Swahili speakers living in London and working for Bush House, for the BBC, I got to know these people quite well during my years as an undergraduate. And by the end of the undergraduate degree, I was able to speak Swahili quite well. We were very well taught, all credit to our teachers. But I could speak Swahili before I'd gone to East Africa. So that when I went to East Africa, I spoke this very coastal form of Swahili, because that's what the people in London spoke, coastal Swahili. So when I fetched up in Kampala in Uganda, where they don't speak that kind of Swahili, they thought it very odd that I should be speaking, and insisted I came from the East African coast. So I had to adjust my Swahili in due course.
But was it easy to get on to, I presume this was a PhD or something?
Yes.
You got funding?
Yes, I got what's called still is, I believe, a Commonwealth scholarship. I was also offered one of the usual doctoral awards offered by I suppose it must have been the Department of Education those days. But you couldn't have both. And the Commonwealth scholarship was much more generous. And so I took that. I dare say, yes, I think that was the right decision to take the Commonwealth scholarship.
Was there any fieldwork training, which we are exhorted to do nowadays?
No, it's amazing, actually. I tell you, I finished my degree sometime in June, and before I knew the result, I was actually in Kampala doing fieldwork. Because the Commonwealth scholarship said I had to be there by the beginning of the Macquarie, so Uganda Macquarie term, which was in July, because initially I had to be registered as an external London student because it was Macquarie University College. So I had to get there by July, so I didn't actually know what class of degree I had. And I certainly had no fieldwork training at all.
Those were the good old days. Do you remember this is the first time you'd been to Africa?
Well, the first time, I'd been to North Africa.
Had you? Yeah.
Yes.
But do you remember that sort of first arrival scene in
Kampala? I do remember, yes. I remember us flying over Lake Victoria, as it was then known, and landing, because we came by plane rather than by boat, and then being driven along in a bus to Macquarie University. And that was the introduction, if you like, to a very optimistic Uganda. Independence was only about a year or two away, and their spirits were high. And it was southern Uganda, which was in those days quite prosperous through cotton and coffee growing. And it was delightful. And Macquarie University College seemed to be new. In fact, it wasn't that new, but the building seemed to be new. And that spirit of optimism pervaded the university, the students. One couldn't have wished for a better setting. I mean, I do think I was very lucky, actually, at that point in time. But the actual fieldwork, I mean, because as I told you, I decided I wanted to study a town, and the town, or the part of the town, was going to be Kampala itself, which is the capital of Uganda, or at least the main town of Uganda. And Aidan Southall was already there, and he had published a few years previously a book on parts of East Kampala, and I wanted to do a follow-up study because his was a very detailed ethnographic survey, and that was fine. It laid the grounds for something perhaps a bit more politically charged, because nationalism was just round the... Well, nationalism was in the air, Kenyans as against Ugandans, as against Tanzanians. And nationhood was being granted first to Uganda, then to Tanzania and Kenya. And so I wanted to look at the forms of urban migration and settlement in the context of the expectations that independence would bring. And that was going to be the theme of the study.
And was it the theme of the study?
It was, yeah. It remained the theme. There were inevitably things which I didn't anticipate. One of these was that I went to Kampala using the lingua franca, which was Swahili. That was fine. But I was almost literally captured by the Kenyan migrant ethnic group, the Luo, who are Nilotic peoples, and therefore related to the Nua. Dinka, of course. They were the so-called southern Nilots rather than the northern Nilots. And they had this reputation. Aidan Southall had written about it, though I hadn't realised at the time. They had this reputation for welcoming foreigners, outsiders, which they did. And they more or less insisted that I also learn some Luo, which I did to an elementary standard at first. I had to work on it much later. And so, though the study was indeed of a polyethnic urban migrant community and the extent to which it was able to settle in this area of Kampala, it was also, without my entirely controlling it, an emerging study of the Luo.
Which you went on to.
Which I went on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you summarise the sort of, very briefly, the sort of outcomes of the research, what the main conclusions? Because this was, as you said, quite pioneering research on urban anthropology.
Yes. Yes, going back to Gluckman, I'd been struck by yet another one of his methodological pieces of advice, which was that, if you remember the famous phrase, an African townsman is a townsman, or an African miner is a miner, what he wanted to say, and I think he was absolutely right in saying it, one mustn't presuppose that urban migrant communities are affected by their rural, traditional, ethnic backgrounds, the so-called tribal backgrounds as they were called. That you couldn't start your analysis of a town by looking at the individual differences of custom. That you had to take first and foremost the fact that they were involved in corporate organisations like mines, or in housing areas where they had common problems. So it was the common problems that should be the starting point. And I certainly accept that to this very day as the right methodological starting point. But it became very clear to me, however, that while that was true, that people in Kampala were people living in Kampala with the problems of what it was to live in Kampala. It was also very clear that the so-called rural, traditional, customary backgrounds were vitally important in shaping the way they would interact not only with each other but with the authorities and politically, cross-cut of course by these issues of emerging nationalism. So while it was a good starting point, Max Lutzman's advice, it was also clear that in fact so-called custom was, or differences of custom, were vital in, as were reshaping the way in which these constituent ethnic units interacted with each other in town. So that became, in a sense, the overarching theoretical theme. So it was not turning like one on its head, but saying, you're right so far, but actually, once we've established that, ethnic differences do count for a lot. Of course, it was at a time when I think this was still being recognised and perhaps hadn't been fully appreciated. And of course, it's a whole question of what one means by ethnic differences and whether they're really shaped by other factors. This we know.
Would you say, I mean, it's a crude question, but would you say you enjoyed your fieldwork, or were you very lonely, or were you very confused, or was it the usual mixture of these things?
I certainly was pretty confused at times, yes, not quite knowing what all this data was going to amount to. I mean, I suppose we paint with broad sweeps of the brush, and I think if I'd realised that at the time, I wouldn't have been so concerned. But I think I found it difficult to reconcile all the detail with something which had to be written up at some stage. Did I enjoy it? Parts of it. Yes, I suppose so. I was never lonely. I was lucky in being captured, as I say, by these Lur. They are a very welcoming people. It's difficult to make generalisations of that kind, of course, but certainly that was my impression. Maybe it's because they were themselves migrants, but I think it was more than that. And so I was never lonely. There was always plenty of company. Yes. That was the question.
Yes, that's. Who was Aidan your supervisor, or was he?
Aidan was my external supervisor. That's right. Yes.
And who was your internal?
Well, I didn't have one when I left. So I was just as one in the preparation. But eventually it became Philip Gallagher.
Oh, right.
But Aidan was there actually in the field. He is himself a remarkable person, as you know.
Yes, tell me something about him.
Well, Aidan is certainly one of my heroes. He was one of the few, I think, who went out to Africa. He went out to Africa in 1946, to Macfarlane, in fact. And he stayed there continuously until, I think, 1964. And then took up posts in America, but still came back to Uganda quite a lot. But this meant that he'd had, nearly 20 years at a time when other anthropologists in Britain would have done their fieldwork and come back to jobs in the UK or perhaps gone to America. He stayed on. And being linguistically very gifted, it meant that he knew various Nilotic dialects. I mean, his command of Alur, which is a Nilotic language, very close to Tulu, the language I knew, his command was absolutely extraordinary. But he also learned Luganda. He could speak Swahili. He knew other varieties of Nilotic dialects apart from Alur. And at the same time, because Francophone communauté was still in evidence in the conference, he spoke French as well. So he had all these linguistic qualities, which of course I much admire, being interested in language myself. He was a man of few words, probably even fewer then than later. And insofar as I could see him about my work, it would be perhaps once every 3 months. And not much was said. I mean, I would do the talking, nervously at first, and then later on relaxing. And he didn't say much, but at the end of it all, he would say one thing. And that one thing would register, and it would be crucial. So I suppose the bits of advice probably didn't amount to more than about 6 or so, but they were all very important in the shaping of the thesis.
And what was Philip like as a supervisor when you came back?
Philip, we formed a friendship on the basis of squash. He's a very good squash player. And though he was, 20 years older than me, and I wasn't that unfit, I was not a bad player myself, he's more than held his own. There were times when he could beat me, and it was pretty evenly fought out on the squash court. So much of our conversation consisted of anthropology generally, over a beer, perhaps in the morning over a coffee, in between squash games. But we never actually discussed my thesis. And not because he's not capable, not because he wasn't generous, but I think he felt that an urban situation was not something he could really say anything about. He himself had done this field work in quite remote places, Karamoja, Turkana, in very difficult, physically very difficult conditions, and it was quite different from the study of a town. So I think it was quite fairly clear that he didn't really feel he could. So, but we talked generally about anthropology, if not about my thesis. I did give him a draft of the thesis to look at, and he altered the spelling of one word. I spelled superseded with two S's. Or did I spell it with a C instead of an S?
Crucial change, but
yes.
minor.
But to this very day, he remains a friend.
When you came back, you came back to SOAS and wrote up your thesis. Were there any contemporaries of yours at SOAS you remember or who went on in anthropology or anything?
Yes. Well, of course, our mutual friend Lionel Kaplan, who became a very close buddy, very, very dear friend. And then, of course, as she was then Pat Bailey, who became Pat Kaplan, who worked for Samang Swahili herself, and also became very linguistically gifted in that language and in French. There was Janet Fitton, also a Swahili, so she was more based at LSE initially and then came over to SOAS. And then she also married someone called Abdullah Budra, who worked in Yemen, and he's also a very close friend who was at SOAS, who was, first language was Swahili, but Arabic was a very close second language. He was himself Kenyan Arab. So these are the people that come to mind immediately as being direct contemporaries.
Was there much social life among the postgraduates at that time? I mean, did you used to all go out and drink together or socialise, or was it a rather lonely existence writing up your
Yes,
thesis?
I think more lonely than... Yes.
So were there sort of writing up later in SOAS? There was this tradition of you had to pass around 3 of your chapters for people to comment on, but that may not have been...
Not then, no. It was one was very much left. Yes, actually, it was quite lonely. Yes, you're quite right. It was Adrian Mayer who introduced this system to which you refer of writing up sessions and exchanges, but not at that time. No.
This was beginning to be the time when people were suddenly halfway through their PhDs offered jobs. Was this the case with you? Or?
I'm afraid so. Yes, yes. I hadn't finished it. And I was offered a job it was advertised as a research fellowship, and I had just come back from East Africa. I'd only been back a few weeks, in fact, when the job came up almost immediately, and I was about a year off submitting the thesis. So I applied for the research fellowship, assuming that would allow me to do research, to finish the thesis and go on to the next project. But they then told me, in the way that institutions in those days did tell you, that it was now to be a lecturership, but that they wouldn't affect my research anyway, because after all, you only become an anthropologist to do research. This was in the days when SOAS in particular was very research-oriented. And, to give an example of that, incidentally, I remember when I came back in 1964, from my doctoral research. I was then appointed as a lecturer, and 2 years later, 1966, I was back in the field. But I'd been urged to do so by Christoph von Führer-Heimdorf, who, after I'd only been back from the field for 1 year, had said, "My dear, it is time you go back to the field. You've been here for a whole year. What are you doing in London?" Which is wonderful, of course. You were actually, as it were, urged to go and study.
So it was at SOAS that you were offered this lectureship?
Yes, I should have said that, yes.
Yeah.
At SOAS, yes.
So you started your lectureship in 1964?
1964, that's right.
And you were more or less, you were the second Africanist, as it were, at SOAS. Because Philip was there.
Philip was there, that's right. Hunter Philip had left by then, of course. I think he hadn't left by then. So I would have been the third Africanist. Huntingford hadn't quite yet retired. So.
And was Abner Cohen there by then?
Abner Cohen came a bit later. I can't remember when he came. No, I have to correct myself there. No, Abner was there, I think also in some research capacity. Yes, so there are four of us. Yes. And you mentioned Abner, because Abner became a tremendous influence.
In what way?
Well, he was carving out for himself a very, I suppose he would call it Mancunian approach, though it was sufficiently distinctive for him to have the right to call it his own approach to politics, and it's, of course, summarised in his book, Two-Dimensional Man, and also one or two articles in which he tries to look at, if you like, what he later denied was a dialectic, but which seemed to need to be a kind of dialectic between symbolic field of relations on the one hand and political-economic order on the other. And I certainly at the time, and I know Lionel Kaplan, we both were very much influenced by this, and also by his sheer imagination. So, yes, he was there. And Zayas as a whole, I think, prospered very much from his presence.
This was a time of great turbulence anthropologically, because it was the two sort of the double prongs of Marxism and structuralism from France were coming in. Were you influenced by either or both of those?
Well, I was partially influenced by what people said about Marxism. I suppose I wish I'd paid rather more attention to it, but I always had this struggle between Weber and Marx. Aspects of both seemed to be relevant, and I wrote a book called Palms, Wine and Witnesses in 1972, which revealed that tension. I thought it, and others have said it. But the Marxist influence actually came from my roommate, Stefan Feuchtwanger,
who I interviewed last week.
And I shared a room with Stefan, and I found him quite inspiring at times. It was great to have someone like that in your room. I mean, normally one doesn't want rooms shared, but this happened to be an unexpected bonus. And so he was full of ideas and energy, and very outspoken. And these were qualities I certainly appreciated. And so I learned quite a lot, I think, about, if you like, Marxism. And of course at UCL there were various people also interested, but it seemed to be very diverse. And if you rounded up all the Marxists at that time in one room and asked them what Marxism was, it would seem you'd get different answers. It was obviously a subject both opening up and yet not entirely well coordinated. But it was certainly an important moment.
And structuralism?
And French structuralism, that came later, I think, for me, if one means in particular the influence of Lévi-Strauss. Probably when I spent a year or two at Sussex University and met David Pocock. There were some very interesting exchanges.
Was that Pocock through Dumont's work?
Yeah. It wasn't that David Pocock was like an unswerving admirer of Lévi-Strauss, but he certainly seemed to be able to pick out from Lévi-Strauss ideas that might be of interest. And so I did take an interest in structuralism at that point, but that wasn't until the early 70s. And at the same time I became interested more thoroughly, not just in language use, which I'd always been interested in, but in linguistics. I mean, obviously the two would go together. So early 70s, yes, linguistics, structural linguistics in particular. Read into that, and we had people at Zayas who could actually lecture on this.
This is now getting into the avancement of the late 60s, when I was at the LSE and Vietnam and the student movement and so on. Did that affect SOAS much?
The événement, les événements. Yes, it did very much. Yeah, yes, it did. That was I think that's one of the hardest times in my life. Very much. Yes, we had difficulties, both within the school and in relationship to outside institutions. And the students were often divided themselves.
Mm.
There were sit-ins, of course, lockouts, lots of recriminations, many of them misunderstood, really.
Mm.
The wrong people being accused.
Mm.
Yeah, it was certainly a difficult time.
Where were you? I mean, you stayed. I mean, two of my friends, David Seddon and Stefan, both left at that point.
Yes.
And Christoph was reputedly quite with the
Quite
established.
what,
With the established.
Yes, well, Abaco and I both felt that was not really entirely clear. My own view is that Christoph sympathised much more with Stefan
Mm.
than people give him credit for. As you know, I think it's well known that I tried to defend Stefan
Mm.
and came out in favour of him. There was a special, I suppose you'd call it a tribunal at Zayas, which seemed to be fairly conducted, I must say. But he nevertheless was asked to move.
Mm.
I don't think he was actually given the sack, but I think he was asked to be
His contract wasn't renewed.
something of that kind.
So, the picture I have from one or two interviews is that the establishment was fairly firm that too much identification with the students and radical thought, and Stefan himself said it was perhaps not a wise thing of his to write an article talking about the imperialism of the SOAS and so on.
Yes.
He himself was partly to blame, for being provocative.
Yes.
I knew Christoph very well, and he always struck me as a very liberal and
Yes.
open-minded person.
Yes.
What was your impression of his role?
Yes, I think that he was caught in a difficult situation. I really don't think that he wanted Stefan to go.
Mm.
I dare say that Stefan may have a different view. I was in a funny sort of situation. I defended Stefan at this tribunal. I'm certain I didn't suffer from doing that. Christoph didn't change his attitude towards me one bit and remained cooperative and courteous. I can only assume, and of course I have no evidence, is that Christoph felt that he was under pressure
Mm.
to adhere to, if you like, an emergent policy
Well,
along the lines that Stefan suggests, yes.
Well, Stefan said that in some meeting Phillips said, this man has got to go. So he rather pushed the blame onto Phillips rather than
Yes.
Christoph.
Yes. I think that probably Phillips, as the head of the institution, was responsible for policy, and that Christoph was, in a sense, carrying out policy and felt he could do no other. But I have to say that in all my dealings with Christoph, his attitudes, his remarks, it would not suggest to me that he wanted Stefan to go.
And more generally on Christoph, he's a person I personally, having worked on his papers and photographs, enormously admire. But, everyone said he went to sleep in the seminars, which I know is true towards the end, but he also set up SOAS as a very big department. He was a very good administrator earlier on.
Yes.
What was your assessment of him as an anthropologist or field worker or head of department?
Well, as head of department, he was, in a sense, just what a department needed, in a way, at that point in time, when we weren't subject to interference by government, REE, HEFKI and so on. He let people get on with their work. It suited us. He was especially clever at recruiting and managed to handpick not only some very good anthropologists, if I may say so, but people whose interests were compatible with each other. And yes, he chose some very good people, and I think that it was a very happy department on the whole. There was that, as I said, that forked period, but that was the only one. And most of them stayed, most of the people stayed in that department, very few actually left. So Christoph had this ability to build up a department of compatible people who were good anthropologists, and to delegate, and so the administration ran smoothly. I suppose the person to whom he delegated most was Adrian Mayer, who of course later succeeded him, and that was a very safe pair of hands.
And as an anthropologist?
As an anthropologist, it was fairly remote to mind, because I wasn't in those days specifically, particularly interested in India, and he was very much an Indianist. The partial exception to that was his book Morals and Merit, which had a much wider appeal. And I suppose it's one of the few works where he does actually generalise and make some very insightful statements. And is very clearly written. He had this very smooth way of writing. If you ever saw him writing, wrote by hand, you know, and never ever, to my knowledge, crossed anything out. So what he wrote was what was eventually published. So as a field worker, he was extensive. He was an ethnographer. He's written material that would last forever. I remember on his retirement, at his retirement celebration, he once said, "Well, I suppose I've never expected anyone to recognise you for my theoretical contribution, but more for my ethnographic." And I suppose that's a fair summary. But of course, it's also the kind of material that will last. I mean, his stuff is for all time.
And Betty, did you know Betty?
Oh yes, Betty, very well. Yes.
She was his rock.
She was his rock. That's right. Yes. She was, if not the power behind the throne, then at least something of a guiding
organiser.
He looked after us all as well.
And very intelligent woman herself.
Absolutely, yes, in her own right. Full of sound advice.
And you mentioned Adrian, but
Yes.
did you become friends with?
Oh yes. Adrian was pure gold. I mean, the sense in which he took on the administration. Well, I mean, he stepped in for Christoph when Christoph was actual head at times as well. And it coincided, I suppose, with the emergence of, accountability, if you like, the ethos of accountability, the first stirrings of it at least, and when universities had to be accountable to the authorities, to the taxpayer, if you like, as it was later called. But he also brought in innovations, such as the one you mentioned earlier, these special writing up groups for post-fieldwork doctoral students. And generally, I think, reorganised the place so that it was much more efficient and smoothly running. And he really devoted his whole life to that. And the other good thing about him, of course, was that, though we didn't realise at the time, he took on the whole burden of this, so that the rest of us could continue to write, do field work and teach. So there was very little administration for the rest of us. Adrian did it all. And I don't think it was until, I succeeded him as head of department. It was not until then I realised how much he'd been doing. So, we do have a very special debt of thanks to both those people, actually, Christoph von Puraheimer and Adrian Mayer.
You mentioned your Palm Wine
Wine and Witnesses
book.
Yes.
Tell me what was the theme of that book?
Well, it was. I'd become interested, I suppose, in the way in which, not so much cultural determinism, but cultural persistence is full of paradoxes. And in that book was really about how there's an ethos of egalitarianism among the people who you would say are, have an egalitarian attitude to the distribution of resources. And one of the aspects of this is the fact that at funerals, for instance, they would have to spend lavishly on a particular funeral and not show themselves to be ungenerous. Everyone had to be generous when the occasion arose. And you would think this would have a levelling effect, and indeed this is what they would say. But it didn't work out that way, because some would be much more successful.
Kind of like George Orwell.
Exactly.
Some are more equal than others.
Exactly. So out of that emerged a small number of successful entrepreneurs who managed not only to satisfy the dictates of the custom of generosity at special festive celebrations like funerals, but also managed to keep enough in reserve to buy up land that other people who were forced to go bankrupt would have to sell. And so out of that egalitarian ethos, you had the emergence of quite a big hierarchy, really, of entrepreneurs monopolising increasingly land, which had now achieved exchange value, and the rest of the population who just lived at just above poverty level. And this is set in the context of an international market for a fluctuating international market for the various goods that they produce: coconuts, copra, to a lesser extent cotton. So that became an interest, if you like, the paradox of culture, that culture promises one thing, or appears to, from the point of view of the people who practice it or members of it, but in fact often throws up unexpected surprises and consequences.
How long were you head of department?
I think formal head of department, not that many years, maybe 4 years, maybe fifth. I think I just stood in for Adrian 1 year as well. But it was immediately after Adrian left and I took it on. But I seemed to remain in a position of, yes. It was that sort of department where people were asked to contribute and so on. So in some respects, I thought I'd never cease being head of department. But it was okay. I mean, there were lots of committees, and I was drafted into helping with the school a lot. The director seemed to. So I did quite a lot of Zoas work, and so a lot of this fed into the anthropology department.
And were you doing new field work in another area, or? Yes,
but I was doing two things at the same time in a funny kind of way, because in the earlier study on Kampala, the polyethnic migrant urban community, was followed by a study of the Giriama, who are Bantu-speaking people, speaking a language not a million miles away from Swahili, on the East African coast. And this people had been suggested to me by Abdullah Budra. And the reason I went to study these people was that I had a hankering to study a remote rural people, having studied a town, given all the right reasons, so to speak, for studying a town. Now reverted almost to, if you like, anthropological type, and wanted to study my own community. And the Giriama hadn't been really studied by anyone else. There had been a district officer who'd written some interesting stuff, but that was over half a century before. So I went to study them in 1966 to 67, about 15 months. And learning a language wasn't too difficult because, as I say, it was quite closely related to Swahili. And it was a Bantu language.
What was the outcomes of that?
Well, that was the Palms, Wine and Witnesses. That was the first publication out of those people. It was a second book, because the first had been, I guess it was the second book, because the first had been on Kampala, the urban study. And then I switched in 1968, I went back to an urban study. This is really a study of urban Luo, Nairobi, Kenya. So the amazing thing is that in the 1960s, I spent almost all the 1960s actually in the field. That was the way things were, how possible that was. So 68, 69, a bit longer perhaps, I was based in Nairobi, but looking at these migrant Luo and tracing out the connections to their rural areas in western Kenya.
So now they're contributing to the world by being president of the
Yeah,
United
that's right.
States.
Yes.
Have you read Obama's autobiography?
Yes, I've read both books. Yes.
What do you think?
Well, I think they're making a good read. Yes, it's not exactly relevant to anthropology.
No.
Perhaps that's
Although his relatives are all a lot
yes.
closely involved in anthropology, but
yes.
he isn't.
He's not. No.
Let's move on. I mean, I don't want to rush you on to Oxford too quickly, but is there anything more we should say before you moved on to Oxford? Any other major?
Well, I suppose the other thing is that, I did the study of urban Luo in Nairobi. There was quite a fat book published about that. It was called, a terrible title, but I suppose it sort of says what I was trying to say. It's called The Cultural Definition of Political Response. And what I wanted to say in the book was that, without wishing to reify culture, there were these, it was really a continuation of this interest in the paradoxes of culture, both shaping and yet internally inconsistent. And so I coined the idea of what I called cultural debate, and said that actually among the Luo polity were quite numerous. There was this cultural debate going on about which direction the community should go. And was often recognised as such. People would talk about it in those terms. And there were sides and factions. It was basically an ongoing discussion, if you like, series of discussions about where the Luo people as a people should go. It was about, if you like, identity search, identity formation and quest. But what I did was pick out the ways in which the rhetoric would be expressed through the analysis of what I called key terms. I can't remember whether this is before or after Raymond Williams' work on key terms, though I wasn't aware of it at the time. And there's been some work on key terms since. And the point about this was that the various kinds of speech making which characterise the various rallies and political events where this debate about destiny and identity were carried out, that there were key terms constantly being emphasised as a kind of summation of particular values. And I was struck by this and felt that, well, though I wasn't a native speaker of Luo, and while I would never have that sense of being a native speaker, that feel for the language, I could understand it well enough to pick out these terms as if through a filter. There was even a kind of an advantage in knowing the language reasonably well, but not knowing it as a native would, as a native speaker would. And so these key terms kept coming to mind and being repeated, like buzzwords in a way, cultural buzzwords. But I also noticed that people who would pose the ideas summarising these key terms would use phrases, and they would be as if they were searching for another kind of way of expressing our position. And so that became, if you like, the interest in that book, the tension between the use of key terms to summarise values which we should all know about, which should be taken for granted and be beyond question, and the struggle on the part of opponents to come up with alternative propositions. And so that tension between the propositional in sentence form and the key terms, which were propositional but in a kind of abridged form. And that was the basis of the cultural debate. I felt that theoretically I thought it was quite an important thing to say, and it has been taken up in various forms by various people.
We haven't mentioned America at all in any of this, but there's a lot of linguistic anthropology in the American tradition.
Yes.
Did you ever visit America or become influenced by any of the American anthropologists?
Yes, actually. I did actually, yes. John Gumperz, in particular.
That's what I was thinking of.
And in fact, I later went to Berkeley as a visiting professor for a semester. I guess he was the one who invited. I mean, he must have been, because he was the one there to receive me. But I'd met John Gumperz before then, of course, at conferences and read his work, and we'd exchanged correspondence. And there was Del Himes. I think those were the two principal people. Del Himes, the ethnography of speaking, and John Gumperz very much the same kind of approach. So they were definite influences, yes.
Well, let's now go to your move to Oxford. Oxford's gain was Cambridge's loss. Tell me the difference between SOAS and Oxford as an anthropologist.
As an anthropologist. That's a tricky question. Well, I think SOAS was very much integrated with the other parts of SOAS. Of course, it was the anthropology department. There was a bounded unit, of course, but there was an African Studies department, and of course there were the centres, regional centres. And it wasn't just at the level of teaching where we shared courses and degrees, but also at the level of research, and especially because it's a nice, coherent, consolidated building. You could actually talk to people from other disciplines. And at SOAS, as well as being able to talk to anthropology, I was easily able to talk to a variety of other people in SOAS from other regions and other disciplines. It was very much an intellectual community based upon the fact that regions were our primary object of study and not disciplines, as it was thought. So I think that area basis, the regional basis of our conversations was very important at SOAS and brought us together. When I got to Oxford, there wasn't this. And in fact, and I knew this before I got to Oxford actually, the reason, I suppose I can answer your question this way, that the reason I was attracted to going to Oxford was that I had noticed, and anyone could notice, that in fact Oxford had tremendous resources. They had the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology itself, social anthropology there, but it also had the Pitt Rivers Museum, it also had human sciences, and then biological anthropology. All these were, at the time, vibrant, considered units. And though they had been, only just before I arrived, amalgamated into one school, they hadn't really been brought together. On the whole, the material culture people were polite and nice, but didn't actually work very much with the social cultural anthropologists, and certainly the biological anthropologists were at a remove. And human science was just taught, and this is something Edward Gardner set up, were taught, but again, the amount of involvement in the ISCA itself was really confined to one or two people who taught for it. And I just thought, before I went, when it was suggested to me that I should go, or at least should apply, that it would be a fantastic opportunity to bring all these bits together in what I later called, what I called then actually, even at interview, a kind of new holistic anthropology. Because I felt at the time anthropology might want to do this. I felt that social anthropology in that old sense was already beginning to look a bit weary. And activism, like a lot of other people, have become interested in material culture. It's even its owners. And they were the first, I suppose, beginnings of an interest in the possibility of biocultural evolution as perhaps now being acceptable. Sociobiology, of course, was a term which had been rejected, as you know, especially through Marshall Sinan's denunciation. But the tide was turning, and I felt that there was an opportunity now to bring all these things together at Oxford, as they had been brought together at UCL very successfully, and at Durham, though not at Cambridge, it seems. I mean, at Cambridge, at that time at least, they still seemed far apart. So at Oxford you had those aspects of anthropology which I've just mentioned, plus of course archaeology. And we had new archaeologists, people like Barry Cunliffe and Chris Gosden, who were very keen on anthropology. And of course there was the Arcanantha degree been set up, which was remains a very good degree. So there was the basis there. But for some reason or other, people hadn't brought all this stuff together. And it was, so I thought that'd be a wonderful opportunity. So I went for that reason. So I can't pretend that things were terribly well coordinated at Oxford, but that was, in a sense, one of the reasons for going. And I think that one or two other people felt that that was the case as well. Whereas at SOAS, you were asking about a contrast, whereas at SOAS, things were already very well integrated in terms of what else went on in the college. It's a much smaller place, of course. And of course, SOAS was also, from the anthropological point of view, very well integrated with UCL, through especially medical anthropology. And myself, Roland Littlewood, and Murray Last had set up medical anthropology degrees in our two institutions. So there's, if you like, a Bloomsbury Centre for medical anthropology. So SOAS was well integrated. Oxford anthropology was fragmented, and I wanted to bring it together.
And did you succeed?
Well, at the moment of speaking, yes. I'm well aware, however, as many people have pointed out, that the experience in America is that the so-called four fields approach develops cracks or schisms, and that this can happen. And of course it could happen. But I do think it's worth the try, and certainly it's very exciting at the moment. We, as you know, we've recruited Harvey Whitehouse in his interest in cognition, and Robin Dunbar. These are two, as it were, late additions. Robin Dunbar, evolutionary biologist, on top of other appointments we made in the last few years. And I personally think it's very exciting at the moment.
So you didn't find it frustrating, because clearly some of your predecessors found it extremely frustrating trying to get anything done in Oxford. Morris must have found it quite difficult, I think. Well, we know he did. And coming from outside to a place like that, there are so many ways of...
That's right, an outsider's got, in a sense, it's double-edged, isn't it, really, being an outsider. On the one hand, yes, you're going to suffer the acrimony of those who don't agree with your changes. As it was often said at Oxford, we do not change. And certainly that point was put to me. On the other hand, being an outsider, you don't have any previous loyalties. So I think that on balance it's possible to break the mould. And I think that anyone going to Oxford now, I would say we have broken that mould. And some will regret that, of course. And I'm very well aware there are probably only 1 or 2 people now who regret that. I think it's better. We now recruit quite openly, and no one now seems to think you must recruit from within Oxford. And most of all our recent appointments have been from people who came from outside Oxford, sometimes not even with an Oxford degree. So things have changed. But yes, you're quite right, it was frustrating. But, that's what one expected.
And socially and sort of intellectually, how was it different? I mean, you mentioned that the integration of area wasn't as strong, but was it integrated in other ways? Did you find, for instance, you could meet people in disciplines well outside those represented in SOAS, for example, the sciences or whatever?
That's right. I mean, intellectually, there was a lot going, and of course, in ISCA itself, intellectually, there were some very good people. Yes, it's on the whole they would work on their own, and I suppose that was almost an expectation. But individually, it produced excellent work. There was never any question of that. That was never in doubt. And as you say, in cognate subdisciplines, there were people. There was in biological anthropology, we had a new professor of biological anthropology, Rick Ward, who was interesting in the sense in which he had some very good ideas, but he tended, in the end, towards the end of his life, since he sadly died before completing his career, he moved more and more towards molecular genetics in his anthropology, and I think the danger there was that he would lose sight of society and culture as an aspect of biological anthropology. But nevertheless, for all that, he did have some interesting ideas, and it remains to be seen whether or not we could have done something. So we certainly talked about it, but there was a long gap, in fact, when there was virtually no biological anthropology. And it's only very, very recently when we appointed, Robin Dunbar, really.
Stanley Uliacek.
Yes, sorry, I beg your pardon. Stanley Uliacek came over to ISCA from, that's right, you're quite right. He really fitted into what we broadly called our medical anthropology program. And he and Elizabeth Shue, of course, were fantastic mainstays in that. And he was very broad. I mean, he wasn't just interested in molecular genetics. He was very interested in the kinds of issues that challenged us in ISCA. He was a member. He is a member of ISCA to this very day.
You had the odd situation. I mean, you were the chair is assigned to All Souls, so you were also at All Souls, presumably during all this period. Whereas All Souls was now headed, the warden was also an anthropologist who had left the chair and gone to All Souls. Yes. So you had a senior person there in the wings, and you also, I think Rodney was probably still alive, was he?
Yes.
So you had 2 senior people giving you contrary advice from the wings. Tell me something about John Davis and Rodney.
Well, John was, I think he was an amazingly good warden of the college. I've said this. He, in the best sense of the word, he kind of led from behind. In other words, he saw where the direction was going and then would orchestrate, if you like, decisions such that they could be carried forward. He ran it very smoothly. And it was a period of consolidation. And the college is a very happy college. I don't know what it was like before. Maybe it was happy before, but I really do think he was an excellent warden. He rather, I suppose, force of duty. So on the whole, he moved away from direct involvement in anthropology. He did write some articles. He wrote a very good article on kinship affiliations in All Souls.
I've read it.
You've read it, yeah. And I thought that was, I don't know what you think, but I thought it was a good...
Founder's Kin.
Founder's Kin, a good article, in which he really brought to bear his anthropological talents. But he didn't do a lot else, actually, anthropologically. And I'm not sure it would have been possible. He used to say, well, no, the college runs to him, but I do feel that had he had more time, he would have written more. And of course, now perhaps he can do this, because he has this very important data on Libyan marriages, alliances. A huge sample, as I understand it. So one hopes he'll do it. But on the whole, he didn't involve himself much in anthropology. He was the Warden of All Souls, which he did very well. I don't think he hardly ever went back to Zeeska. We used to invite him to one or two events, and one or two he might come to, garden party, that kind of thing. But on the whole, he didn't, and I guess that must have been a choice he made, that he couldn't do both.
And what about Rodney?
Well, Rodney, I liked Rodney, kind of curious character. I liked him mainly because his reminiscences. As you know, Rodney didn't talk with, he talked at for the most part. But that was all right, because I was quite happy to listen to him, because he did have some extraordinary reminiscences. His wartime years, for instance. And he would also make comment on particular intellectual shifts and movements, but usually not sustained. Of course, one of his party tricks, so to speak, is that before you arrive with your guest, before he would like to see you people, he would find out what their speciality was and look up something, and immediately ply them with a question about the field. So he would come across as very learned, which of course he was learned, and the guest would be pleasantly surprised that he would know so much about this field. But he was, of course, very widely read, and he did have a lot of skill.
This was all at All Souls, because he also...
No, he never came into the college except for Encenia.
Really?
Yeah.
And he didn't come to the department, was he?
No, never.
So where were you meet him?
One would meet him at his flat.
I see.
In Holywell, which was a flat owned by Merton College, which he'd got when he was at Merton College.
I see.
So, 3-4 times a term, there would be tea at Rodney's from 4:30 until 6, precisely. And it was good fun, actually.
You were invited on your own or with others?
He would invite me on my own, but if there was a new member of staff, he would like to meet them. And that was a nice way of them seeing him, because people wanted to see him. And he had lots of people visiting him from the States, for instance. So he led a full life, which was almost like a voyage through life through other people, because they would come from different parts of the world as well as from within Oxford, and they'd bring with them their experiences, and he would sample those experiences, and he wouldn't need to travel.
And what about your famous predecessor 2 or 3 generations back, Evans Pritchard? Did you know him at all?
I met him properly once. I met him briefly on another occasion, but properly once. This was arranged by David Pocock when I was for a very brief time at Sussex University. And it was the custom at the time, apparently, according to David Pocock, for Evans Pritchard, who by then had retired. This must have been early 70s. Evans Pritchard had retired, but he used to come down for a week to Brighton. And normally it would be David Pocock who would host him and look after him. But on this one occasion, I'd only just come to Sussex. As I said, it was only for a short period. So David Pocock came to myself and Ralph Grillo, who was also at Sussex, and explained that Evans Pritchard was coming for his customary summer week in Brighton, and would we like to host him. So we agreed. It was an opportunity after all. And we spent the best part of a day actually with him. And David Pocock said there were 2 things we should know about him. The first is we'd recognise him because his white underpants would be visible from above his trousers at the hotel. We'd be able to recognise that. The second was that he would take us to a pub and suggest various things to eat and of course drink, and then expect us to pay. And that also proved to be the case.
He was drinking, because later he was not allowed to drink.
That's right, yes. But on this occasion he didn't drink much. It was just a pub lunch.
And was his conversational...
His conversation was stupendous. It was gossip, pure gossip, but it was quite good. He seemed to know everyone at Cambridge, from Leavis to countless others. And I suppose he did know them. Very articulate, very shrewd.
Although he was only there a year, but he...
Is that right? Well, he seemed to know a lot about Cambridge. I don't know why we focused on that.
He was close friends of Myers, so maybe...
Oh yes, maybe that was it. But he was very articulate and very shrewd, slightly caustic, of course, as you would expect. The only intellectual exchange, I suppose, was the fact when he discovered I'd worked among Lua. He himself had worked among Lua, and he said he would make over his field notes to me, and that he'd prefer to do that than give them to Aidan Southall, because Aidan had once, of course, criticised him quite heavily in his own work. Quite right, I might say. But I would have liked to have received those notes. But when he died, I didn't get them. I never really did discover where they were, and I did ask his... I'm not quite sure who his literary executor was.
Deirdre, I think, his daughter, probably.
Really?
And Godfrey was, but he went as well.
Yes, well, maybe I approached the wrong people, but... So the notes never came my way. But it would have been good to have had them.
Was his work at all influential, his ideas influential on your work in any way?
You mean his...
EP's work, I mean his theories in...
Zandi and Lua rather than Lua.
Yeah.
Not really. I think that insofar as there's an influence, it's an influence that Evans Pritchard worked, as it were, in toward us. I suppose the one thing that, yes, I suppose there was a kind of methodological influence, and that would be what I've since called, I don't know, at least I've called it, maybe as others have as well, implicit theory. It seems to me that Evans Pritchard is very good at that you can write a very readable book about a people, but it's actually full of theoretical ideas which are implicit. And so it was that people used to pick up, whether twins are birds or vegetables, or and so on. There were plenty of instances of that, and the notion of secondary elaboration. There's quite a lot in this stuff. So I think that influence, only in the general sense in which we're all influenced, perhaps, sometimes without knowing it, by his work. The segment, my work on Lua, insofar as I was influenced very much more by Aidan Southall, who wrote this book called, wrote a pamphlet actually to the International African Institute called Lineage Formation Among the Lua, which is really an amazing piece of work of scholarship, very detailed and yet arranged in such a way that it made general sense about the whole notion of segmented lineage societies. We know that there are very few that quite fit that model. Probably, and possibly they're confined only to Nilotes, I don't know. But it didn't. Whereas Evans Pritchard's work, I think, left too many questions unanswered about the fact that most lineages, after all, were not localized, and how did they actually coordinate and move together, or engage in, if you like, a relational framework. So that would be my answer, I think.
And now we have a mutual interest in the Nagas.
Yes.
I understand. Yes. How has that come about?
Well, my wife Vipa has worked among Naga.
Vipa Joshi.
Vipa Joshi, that's right. Yes, she's worked among Naga for many. I mean, her father, who was a chief of police, worked in Nagaland when she was very young. So in a sense, there's been early exposure through him, really. And she later came to realise that she'd like to work among the Naga. And she had also worked among a people called Saharia in Madhya Pradesh. These are, if you like, a tribal people. But anyway, the Nagas. And so it means that she worked among the Angami Naga. And she worked in Nagamese, principally. But it does mean that she obviously knew the works of Christopher von Fiora, Heimendorff, Mills, Hutton, Kaufman, very thoroughly by the time I met her. And there was a common interest in Heimendorff. She never met, sadly, which is a great shame.
It's a pity.
Yeah, it is a pity. But we could still talk about him because his presence is very much there, isn't it, in his writings.
And Ursula Graham Barnes, she probably didn't meet either, but a lot of their objects are in the Pit Rivers, as you know. So
now the connection to which you refer is that we're now engaged in what we call the Nagaland University Anthropology Initiative, which is to try and set up a department of anthropology in Nagaland University. This is really her enterprise, and I'm sort of helping out of it. But she's done all the spade work. And it's the request or the suggestion of her suggestion to which the Vice-Chancellor of Nagaland University responded that yes, it would be good to have anthropology in Nagaland because the Naga themselves want it. They're very well aware, of course, that to some extent Nagaland was one of the cradles of British social anthropology or European social anthropology or ethnography. and they want it for themselves, and there's lots of interest. And so now we're doing this now, and you yourself have been very helpful in giving us advice and even some resources. And we've now heard from the Indian government, University Grants Committee, that they will now set up a department to the tune of 1 professor and 2 lecturers.
Excellent.
So that's got to go through. And meanwhile, we've applied to various foundations, and we want to set up a kind of an exchange relationship. We've already drawn up a memorandum of understanding between Oxford University and Nagaland University and the Museum of Culture in Basel in Switzerland. It's a kind of a 3-pronged relationship, which would look at exchanges both of students and faculty, and also research. So it's quite ambitious. And as in anywhere, in any part of the world, these things can come to nothing. But so far, so good, and we keep our fingers crossed. But it's a lot of work, and we never know. But we want to do it, and there seems to be some enthusiasm. Of course, it's got to actually happen before we can be satisfied.
Excellent. Well, we're nearly coming to the end, but tell me about your present and future work. I mean, now you have all this time ahead of you.
All this time.
What are you working on?
I've become interested in, this will sound very strange, though to some extent is already implicit in this book I edited a couple of years ago called Holistic Anthropology, in which I try to bring together biocultural, evolutionary anthropology and material culture and social anthropology, often through, if you like, human ecology or interest in human ecology. I call it holistic anthropology. And I've become interested in these issues of cognition, evolutionary psychology, and the evolution of human social groups, and in particular the role of language in all this, the evolution of language and kinship, which some people have expressed an interest in generally. So that's what I'm reading into quite a lot now. What I will write, I don't know. I mean, there's such a vast literature that it is like starting right at the beginning. It's got all the pleasures of being a novice back behind the desk at school, learning for the first time. And it is really quite different from what we eventually understand as sociocultural anthropology, and yet it's very relevant. I mean, it's almost human sciences, isn't it? So that's the direction I'm going in terms of reading, and hopefully the odd paper. Plus, of course, this interest in Nagaland and in continuing to visit East Africa, and I'm sure I will continue to write things about Islam and medicine, but they will not be the only things I do.
It's a huge new project. Is there anything that we've missed out that you would have liked me to have asked you, or do you think we've covered everything more or less?
I think we've probably covered as much as I can think.
Okay, well, you'll find as you walk out the door, you'll remember all the other things.
Oh, yes.
But up till now, thank you very much indeed, David.
Thank you.